What does it really mean to call a place home? We like to imagine home as the answer to uncertainty. Four walls, a locked door, a roof that keeps out the rain, ground that stays where it is. We build our lives around that promise, often without noticing how deeply we trust it. But across the world, there are homes that do not offer that kind of reassurance. Houses cling to cliffs that shed stone grain by grain. Villages rise from water where there is no street, only passage. Rooms are carved into rock, suspended above ravines, hidden in trees, balanced on edges where wind, flood, and time never fully rest. In these places, shelter is not the end of danger. It is a conversation with danger renewed every day. This is not a story about reckless people chasing thrills. It is something quieter and more profound than that. These homes were shaped by necessity, memory, invasion, faith, weather, and the stubborn human instinct to remain. Again and again, people have chosen to stay where the land seemed to resist them, not because they were blind to risk, but because meaning had taken root there. Look closely, and these dwellings begin to feel less like curiosities and more like mirrors. They ask an old question in a new way. Is safety the absence of fear, or the decision to keep living with dignity beside it? A house can be built from stone, wood, mud, or volcanic ash, but a home is made from something less visible. Habit, hope, devotion, the refusal to surrender a place simply because it is hard to keep. So we begin at the edges of the map, where ordinary life unfolds in extraordinary balance, not in palaces or monuments, but in fragile shelters that hold generations of memory. And with each one, another version of the same truth emerges. Sometimes the most human homes are the ones built where comfort was never guaranteed. What would it feel like to wake each morning with a cliff just beyond your back wall? Not a scenic overlook visited on a weekend, but a real drop, immediate and vertical, woven into the ordinary geometry of daily life. In a small village in Catalonia, that question is not poetic. It is practical. Castellfollit de la Roca rises on a blade of dark basalt, shaped long ago by ancient lava and slowly revised by weather ever since. From a distance, the village looks less like something built than something balanced. A line of stone houses rests along the edge, as if the earth had narrowed itself on purpose, offering just enough room for a single street and a few hundred years of persistence. The homes seem to grow from the rock beneath them. Their walls echo the cliff itself, dark, dense, and weathered by the same history. But beauty here comes with an unsettling intimacy. Gardens end where open air begins. Windows look out over a drop that does not soften with familiarity. The village has endured for centuries, yet endurance is not the same as certainty. Water enters small fractures in winter. Heat expands them in summer. Time, patient and unsentimental, keeps working at the edge. No single day announces the change. A little stone loosens. A face of rock gives way. The land does not collapse all at once. It simply continues becoming something else. And still life goes on. Cars are parked. Bread is bought. Children laugh in streets where the horizon feels unusually close. Perhaps that is the first lesson these homes offer. People do not wait for the world to become perfectly secure before they begin living. They learn its moods. They build anyway. They love anyway, because the cliff beneath Castellfollit is more than a danger. It is also a reminder. Stability is often just erosion, moving slowly enough for us to call it permanent. What if the safest place in a time of violence was not behind a wall, but inside a mountain? In the highlands of northwestern Iran, there is a village that seems to have emerged not from construction, but from disappearance. At first glance, Kandovan looks like a landscape of stone spires shaped by wind and patience. Then a doorway appears, then a window, and slowly the mountain reveals that people are living inside it. The cone-shaped formations were born from ancient volcanic ash, compressed over ages into soft tuff, and carved by weather into tall, tapering towers. Centuries ago, families fleeing invasion found refuge here. They did not raise new houses against the horizon. They hollowed shelter from the land itself, turning geology into protection and silence into survival. Inside these stone cones, life settles into unusual contours. Rooms curve where ordinary walls would meet. Stairways rise through interiors chiseled by hand. Livestock once occupied the lower levels, while families lived above, storing food near the pointed tops. The architecture feels ancient, yet wires, lamps, and daily routines thread the present through it. A home can carry centuries and still hold modern breath. What is striking is not only the ingenuity, but the emotional logic of the place. These dwellings were born from fear, yet over time, fear hardened into belonging. What began as refuge became inheritance. Children were raised in rooms their ancestors carved while running from destruction. The shapes that once hid people from history eventually gave them a way to remain within it. There is something deeply human in that transformation. We often think of survival as temporary, a bridge to some more settled life. But sometimes survival itself becomes culture. Sometimes the shelter built in urgency becomes the place where memory takes root. And Kandovan leaves behind a quiet question. When people adapt so completely to a difficult landscape, are they merely enduring it? Or have they discovered that home is not the absence of hardship, but the art of making intimacy with what once frightened them? How far would a people go to escape those who came to take them? In southern Benin, the answer was not into the forest or over a mountain, but out onto the water. There, on Lake Nokwe, a community built a life in a place their enemies would not follow. Ganvié does not begin with architecture. It begins with fear sharpened by history. Centuries ago, as slave raids swept through the region, the Tofinu people understood that remaining visible on land meant remaining vulnerable. Water, however, offered a strange kind of mercy. Bound by spiritual taboos, their attackers avoided it. So families drove wooden poles into the lakebed and raised houses above the surface, transforming refuge into settlement. Today, the village seems to float between sky and reflection. Homes stand on stilts. Schools, places of worship, and small businesses rise from the water in the same manner, as though the lake itself had agreed to lend its surface for human use. There are no roads to follow, no sidewalks, no familiar rhythm of footsteps on earth. Movement happens by canoe. Children learn balance and current the way others learn curbs and crossings. Yet the beauty of Ganvié carries its own fragility. Timber weakens, water levels shift, fish stocks change. The lake that once protected the village also demands constant negotiation. Each repaired post, each rebuilt platform, is a quiet acknowledgement that safety is never a one-time achievement. It must be maintained, adapted, earned again. Still, life there is not defined only by peril. Meals are shared, markets open at dawn, voices drift across the water in the soft traffic of ordinary mornings. What began as an act of escape became a world complete enough to hold generations. That may be the most moving part of the story. People did not merely survive on the lake. They learned how to belong to it. And perhaps that is what home often becomes in the end. Not the place untouched by history, but the place where history could not succeed in erasing you. What kind of home rises not from the ground, but away from it? Deep in the rainforests of Papua, among dense canopies and wet green silence, there are houses lifted high into the air, as if the people who built them had decided that the forest floor was only the beginning of the landscape, not the center of it. For the Korowai, height is not a flourish. It is protection, strategy, and memory shaped into wood. Their homes are built high in the trees, sometimes startlingly high, supported by trunks, poles, lashings, and an understanding of the forest that outsiders rarely possess. To look at one from below is to feel the old instinctive dizziness of our species, the body reminding the mind that falling has always been one of our first fears. And yet families live there. Fires are tended. Food is carried up. Children climb what others would hesitate even to touch. A narrow notched trunk can serve as staircase, threshold, and test of nerve all at once. Every ascent asks for balance. Every descent asks for trust. Life is measured not only in time, but in vertical effort. There is reason for this elevation. Floodwaters can swallow the ground below. Insects and disease move thickly through the lower air. Height offers distance from danger and a clearer view of what approaches. But it also creates a deeper kind of separation, as though the home exists in dialogue with the treetops rather than the soil. These structures do not pretend to permanence. Rain, humidity, insects, and time slowly reclaim them. So they are repaired, replaced, rebuilt. The forest is not conquered, it is negotiated with. Shelter becomes less an object than a cycle, a recurring act of attention. That may be what makes these homes so compelling. They remind us that security is not always found in heaviness, in concrete, in things anchored and still. Sometimes safety lives in lightness, in altitude, in knowing when to rise above the ground instead of clinging to it. And sometimes the homes that seem most precarious are the ones most deeply adapted to the world around them. What happens when a town outlives the ground beneath it? In central Italy, Civita di Bagnoregio answers that question with a kind of heartbreaking grace. It sits above a landscape it no longer fully belongs to, on a plateau of volcanic stone that erosion has been patiently carrying away for centuries. From afar, the village appears almost imagined, a cluster of warm buildings resting on a pedestal of pale rock. It is beautiful in the way fragile things often are. To arrive there, you cross a long pedestrian bridge suspended over ravines that were once part of the same land. The walk feels ceremonial, as though you are leaving one century and entering another, but also faintly uneasy because the path itself reminds you that the village has already been separated from the world that once held it. The stone beneath Civita is soft enough to be shaped by rain, wind, and gravity over long stretches of time. A few centimeters may vanish in a year. That sounds minor until one remembers how years accumulate. A little weather becomes a missing ledge. A missing ledge becomes a vanished corner of town. Here, loss does not arrive dramatically. It arrives by increments, and that can be more haunting. Yet people have remained, not many, but enough to keep the village from becoming only a monument to disappearance. Doors still open, meals are still cooked, footsteps still echo through narrow lanes. The place persists in that tender space between inhabited and remembered, as though refusing to choose between life and elegy. Civita offers a different kind of extremity than the homes built against flood or cliff or storm. Its danger is slower, almost polite. It does not threaten with sudden violence, but with eventual surrender. That may be harder to face. How do you love a place you know is gradually going away? Perhaps by loving it more attentively. Perhaps by understanding that permanence was never the bargain. And perhaps by accepting that some homes do not teach us how to hold on forever. They teach us how to remain present while the world quietly and continuously changes beneath our feet. What would it mean to sleep beneath a mountain and call that comfort? In southern Spain, there is a town where the sky can vanish in the middle of a street. One moment there is sunlight on whitewashed walls. The next, an immense sweep of rock curves overhead, and the town seems to withdraw into the earth without ever fully entering it. Setenil de las Bodegas was shaped by water long before it was shaped by people. Over ages, the river carved through stone, leaving deep channels and monumental overhangs that resemble frozen waves. Rather than resisting those formations, generations of residents did something more intimate. They moved beneath them. They treated the mountain not as backdrop, but as roof. The result is a place where architecture and geology are almost impossible to separate. Facades, doors, balconies, and kitchens exist beneath enormous shelves of stone that seem too heavy for imagination. The human part of the house is visible in lime-washed walls and modest windows. The rest belongs to the mountain, looming above in silence. It is a shared structure, though only one partner breathes. And yet, that is precisely what gives the town its strange peace. The rock insulates from heat. The overhang shelters from rain. What might seem oppressive from the outside has, for centuries, offered a practical kind of refuge. People do not merely endure the stone above them. They organize their lives around its steadiness, trusting a mass they did not place there and cannot control. Still, one can feel the psychological tension. To live under open sky is one thing. To live under suspended earth is another. However rational the geology may be, the imagination remains restless. It asks quiet questions in the dark. How much weight hangs above this bed? How long has it held? What exactly does trust mean when it depends on something so vast? Perhaps that is Setinel's quiet lesson. Safety is not always about removing what frightens us. Sometimes it is about learning to dwell beneath it until fear becomes familiarity, and familiarity becomes a kind of faith. What draws a person to the side of a cliff and persuades them not only to stand there, but to stay? High in the Zanskar region of the Himalayas, Phuktal Monastery seems less constructed than revealed. as though the mountain had opened a hidden chamber and human devotion slowly gave it form. From across the gorge, the structure appears improbable, almost weightless, clinging to the rock face above the river like a thought that refused to fall. Its origins lie in a search for solitude. A cave in the cliff became a place of prayer, and prayer, over time, became a community. Walls of mud and stone gathered around the opening. Timber found its place in natural cracks. Passageways linked rooms that seemed to hover between gravity and intention. Nothing about it feels engineered in the modern sense. Everything about it feels learned from the mountain itself. To reach it is to understand something of its meaning. The journey is long, often on foot, across terrain that does not welcome haste. There is no casual arrival here. Every step narrows the distance between the outer world and a quieter one. By the time the monastery comes into view, perched above the emptiness, it no longer feels like an accident of construction. It feels like the endpoint of a decision, to live where distraction cannot easily follow. And yet the danger is undeniable. Narrow paths trace the cliff with little room for error. Weather changes quickly. Supplies must be carried in. Illness and emergency have never been convenient companions here. Still, life continues in prayer, study, cooking, repair, repetition. The dramatic setting does not cancel ordinary routine. It gives it sharper contour. That may be why places like Phuktal stay in the imagination. They reveal that human beings do not seek shelter only from the world. Sometimes they also seek shelter from noise, from speed, from the constant pull of elsewhere. And in doing so, they choose difficult places not because they are easy to survive, but because they make certain forms of attention possible. So the monastery remains, held between stone and sky, asking a question the modern world rarely pauses to consider. What if peace has always required a little distance from everything that claims to be necessary? What does it feel like to live above a coastline that is still being carved away? In Bonifacio, on the southern tip of Corsica, the answer is written in white limestone and sea wind. The town rises along a cliff above the Mediterranean, luminous from a distance, almost unreal in afternoon light. But approach from the water, and a stranger truth becomes visible. The land beneath it is not simply steep, it is undercut. For centuries, waves have worked at the base of the cliff, shaving into the limestone from below. The sea has hollowed the rock in a way that makes the upper edge seem to lean out into open space. Houses near the rim appear suspended above nothing, as though architecture were daring geology to hesitate one day longer. Beauty and instability stand here in the same frame, inseparable. Inside the town, life follows familiar patterns. Laundry shifts in the breeze. Doors open onto narrow streets. Conversations drift through old stone lanes shaped by weather and memory. Yet beneath that continuity is a low, constant awareness that the cliff is not fixed in the way it appears. The sea below is not merely scenery. It is an active force, patient and repetitive, shaping the future one impact at a time. There is something humbling in that rhythm. Human beings often build as though permanence were a reasonable expectation. The ocean answers with repetition, not anger, not cruelty, simply persistence. Wave after wave, year after year, it returns to the same task. The town remains because erosion is slow, but slowness should never be mistaken for mercy, and still Bonifacio endures. Not because its people have defeated the sea, but because they have accepted a harder truth, that all beauty exists in time, and all foundations are part of a larger process than we can control. To live there is to understand that the view is magnificent, not despite its fragility, but partly because of it. The cliff is wearing away. The town is still standing. Between those two facts, an entire philosophy of home quietly takes shape. What if death did not leave the house when the heart stopped beating? In the highlands of Sulawesi among the Toraja, the boundary between the living and the dead has long been understood in a gentler, more continuous way. Here, grief is not always rushed toward closure. It lingers, speaks, waits, and in waiting, becomes part of family life itself. When a loved one dies, the departure is not always treated as immediate. The body may remain in the home for months, sometimes longer, cared for with tenderness and ritual attention. The deceased is not spoken of as absent in the absolute sense. They are still addressed, still included, still woven into the daily emotional fabric of the household. Meals are brought, words are offered. Time does not sever relationship as quickly as many modern cultures expect it to. To outsiders, this can feel startling, even unsettling. But within Toraja life, it reflects something deeply coherent. Love does not obey the administrative pace of burial. Mourning has its own tempo. A funeral is not merely a farewell, but a major communal passage, often requiring long preparation, sacrifice, gathering, and expense. The ceremony is not postponed because death is denied. It is postponed because the transition matters too much to rush. Even after burial, connection continues. The dead are placed in rock tombs or cliffside resting places, accompanied by carved effigies that look out over the land. In some traditions, bodies are later brought out, cleaned, redressed, and reintroduced to the family in ritual remembrance. These moments are not performances of the strange. They are expressions of continuity, a refusal to reduce a person to a date on a stone. And perhaps that is what this way of living reveals most clearly. Home is not always a shelter from mortality. Sometimes it is the place where mortality is allowed to remain visible, where memory is given a chair at the table, and where love, even after death, is not asked to leave quietly. What kind of person rebuilds a house that the river has already destroyed? On the Drina River in western Serbia, the question hangs in the air like mist above fast water. In the middle of the current, balanced on a solitary rock, stands a small wooden house that seems less like architecture than an act of insistence. It began simply, almost playfully. A few young swimmers wanted a place to rest between dives, a shelter from the sun on a rock that interrupted the flow. They carried boards out by boat and built a tiny cabin where no cabin had any practical reason to exist. It was modest, improvised, hardly more than one room suspended between water and weather. And then the river rose and took it away. That might have been the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning. Floods returned. The house was broken apart more than once. Planks vanished downstream. The rock was stripped bare. Yet each time people came back. They brought tools, timber, patience, and the strange human refusal to let destruction have the final word. The house did not become permanent. It became recurrent. There is something deeply moving in that distinction. We often admire endurance as the ability to withstand. But this little structure offers a different model. It does not always withstand. It disappears. What endures is the decision to rebuild. Survival here is not the uninterrupted preservation of form. It is loyalty renewed after loss. Seen from the riverbank, the house looks fragile against the strength of the current. Seen another way, it looks almost defiant, not because it can defeat the river, but because it continues answering force with return. The water says nothing, only rises and falls. The people answer in wood and nails. And perhaps that is why this small house lingers in memory. It suggests that home is not always the place that remains untouched. Sometimes it is the place we choose again, precisely because the world has proven it can be taken away. What do all these homes begin to say when we place them beside one another? A village on a volcanic blade, rooms carved into stone cones, houses rising from water, from trees, from cliffs, from the memory of the dead, from a rock in the middle of a river. At first they seem like separate marvels, scattered across continents and centuries. But slowly another pattern emerges. These are not isolated oddities. They are variations on a single human sentence. We were here, and we found a way to remain. Each place began with a pressure greater than comfort: invasion, flood, scarcity, erosion, altitude, exposure, spiritual obligation. The world did not offer ideal ground, so people redefined what ground could mean. A lake became a refuge. A mountain became a roof. Height became safety. Fragility became routine. Again and again, necessity called forth imagination, and imagination settled into tradition. What is most striking is not simply ingenuity, but intimacy. These communities did not just survive unusual landscapes, they learned them. They listened for the moods of rivers, the language of stone, the habits of weather, the quiet warnings carried in wood, wind, and water. Their homes are not monuments to dominance. They are records of relationship. They show what it looks like when human beings stop asking nature to become convenient and instead begin adapting themselves to its terms. There is humility in that, but also dignity. Modern life often equates security with control. Yet these homes suggest another possibility. Perhaps security is not the fantasy of mastering every risk, but the wisdom of building meaning in full view of risk. Perhaps a life becomes deeper, not shallower, when it is lived with awareness of its precarity. And so the story begins to widen. We are no longer only looking at extraordinary dwellings. We are looking at an older human inheritance, the ability to improvise belonging in an unstable world. Not perfectly, not permanently, but with enough courage, memory, and care to call it home anyway. What do these homes reveal about us when the novelty fades and only the deeper meaning remains? Perhaps this: human beings are not defined solely by the places that welcome them. We are also shaped by the places that test us, resist us, and ask more of us than comfort ever could. A cliffside village teaches vigilance. A dwelling carved into stone teaches patience. A house above water teaches flexibility. A room shared with memory and mourning teaches continuity. A cabin rebuilt after every flood teaches resilience stripped of romance. Each place carries its own burden, but also its own wisdom. Together they suggest that survival is never only physical. It is emotional, cultural, spiritual. People do not hold on to difficult homes simply because they have nowhere else to go. Often they stay because leaving would mean surrendering a story about who they are. There is a tenderness in that kind of persistence. Not all strength arrives as conquest. Sometimes it appears as maintenance, as repetition, as the quiet labor of repairing what may need repair again. A roof patched before rain, a walkway reinforced before winter, a boat tied securely for morning, a prayer offered in a place where stone and sky feel very close together. These acts may seem small beside the scale of mountains and rivers, yet they are the very substance of human continuity. And maybe that is the hidden thread connecting every chapter. Home is never just protection from the elements. It is a way of placing the self in time. It allows memory to accumulate, relationships to deepen, rituals to survive. Even in unstable places, perhaps especially there, home becomes the vessel that carries identity from one generation to the next. So as we approach the end of this journey, a final thought begins to take shape. The question is no longer why anyone would live in such precarious places. The more interesting question may be this: without such acts of staying, rebuilding, and remembering, what would remain of the human story at all? In the end, these homes are not really about extremity. They are about relationship, between people and landscape, between danger and devotion, between what the world allows and what the human heart still dares to make within it. Strip away the cliffs, the rivers, the stone, the height, and what remains is something deeply familiar: the longing to belong somewhere, even when somewhere asks much more of us than we expected to give. Across these stories, one truth returns in different forms. Home is rarely a perfect shelter. It leaks, it shifts, it erodes, it carries the weight of memory and the pressure of time. Yet people continue to build, repair, inhabit, and love these places because home has never been only about protection. It is also about meaning, about choosing a location in the world and answering again and again, yes, here. Here is where we will cook, mourn, wait, laugh, pray, grow old, and remember. That may be why these dwellings stay with us. They expose something modern life often tries to hide. There is no such thing as complete safety. Not in cities, not in suburbs, not behind locks, insurance, forecasts, or reinforced walls. Every home exists inside uncertainty. The difference is that some homes make that uncertainty visible. And in doing so, they reveal a kind of courage the rest of us often overlook. So perhaps the lasting question is not which of these places seems most impossible. Perhaps it is this: what makes any place worth returning to, worth defending, worth rebuilding after loss? The answers will differ from one life to another. But somewhere inside them all is the same quiet impulse that built on cliffs, floated on water, carved into rock, and rode back to a river stone after the flood had passed. We do not endure because the world becomes stable. We endure because we keep making places for tenderness inside instability. And maybe that, more than stone or timber or earth, is the oldest architecture we possess.